Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for having us today, and thanks to all of you all for joining us. My name is Kenny Taylor, and I serve as the Director of Outreach and Professional Development at the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy at the Bush School at Texas A&M University. We're going to have a conversation about social justice leadership at nonprofit organizations. And in full disclosure, this is a continuing education program certificate that we launch here in the fall of this year in August. So again, thank you so much for having us. I'm joined today by Ms. Jasmine Walia and also with Dr. Duchess Humphrey, who all helped conceptualize, along with a few other colleagues at the school, the program and our concepts that we'll visit with you today about. If we go ahead and shift to the uh, slide deck, we can go even one forward. So I'll do some opening remarks on social justice, leadership, or framework, anyways, for my class, which is the first course, and provide some perspective as well, how that's integrated throughout the program in itself. And then Miss Walia will visit with you. I won't read through all of those, but she'll visit with you about three of the courses that are also embedded within our framework. And then Dr. Duchess Humphrey will spend 10 minutes with you in her expertise area of cultural competency, which also makes up a piece of how we conceptualize our social justice leadership program. So to go ahead and get going and talking about, or visiting with you anyways, about our perspective on social justice leadership within nonprofit organizations. And really what we say from the beginning, to be transparent, is that this is really an exploration of structural inequities, which have led to so few people of color holding leadership roles at nonprofit organizations, both at the board and executive staff level. This is not just because I serve in an academic area, but I just want to make sure that I let you know a little bit about me. Before transitioning into academia full time, served as a practitioner really straight out of college, or even while I was in college as an undergraduate. And as soon as I landed in a nonprofit organization, one of the questions that I had going all the way back to then is why so few people look like me within the industry, whether it be frontline staff at that point in time, executives, and folks that I came across that were members of the board. So, again, in the name of being transparent, we really talk about, or what we're interested in is this attempt to answer the question of what will it take to accelerate racial equity at nonprofit organizations. One of the reasons why I personally believe this is so important just kind of goes back to what I mentioned to you about my practitioner experience. I spent time with the Salvation Army, with the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, and 12 years with Big Brothers Big Sisters, serving in a variety of capacities there. And the one thing that I never really truly understood is many times we were working in communities of color, and data says the same thing, that many nonprofit organizations serve in communities of color. And so there were times certainly along the way that I wondered, were we doing the right things? Were we making the right decisions? Because none of the people, again, I'm reflecting on my early career, looked like who we were serving. So who we hope that we're attracting and what we hope to promote, even today, is really what we believe has happened is diversity issues, racial issues. We're way more aware of what those things are. And but what hasn't happened is, now for nearly 30 years of tracking demographics at nonprofit organizations, we know that boards and executive leaders remain very white, if you will. So we really seek to find people that are interested in taking part in that conversation. So what's going on inside our nonprofit organizations in relation to social inequities, and making sure that we address those internally if we're the ones that are out in the public promoting the same ideas. So when we think about what those barriers or what those structural systemic things are within nonprofit organizations, we can think about hiring practices, pay equity, and opportunities for advancement that continues to stick out in the research pretty heavy of the reason why many people leave the nonprofit sector. Discriminatory procedures or what even happens when something negative from a racial standpoint happens at an organization between employees. How is it even addressed? What type of well-being policies do we have? Being proactive, generally speaking, to identify biases that we have and work on those, again, those more structural things at nonprofit organizations. We go ahead and slide to the next. So I won't read through all of these, but just to give you a summary of our first course, if you will, on social justice leadership in nonprofit organizations, what we really try to do is introduce the idea that we're interested in as an educational of promoting the idea of higher racial equity in leadership roles at nonprofit organizations. We see the demographics trending in the right way with young leadership, more people of color coming into the industry. We're just in that day of an age where younger folks are interested in public service. So more students, more practitioners are developing every day. So to address that idea of what can I personally take responsibility for in addressing this issue at our organizations. And then what we try to do next is go deeper on the topic. So we get into discussing barriers. And then from there, what we ask those folks that have jumped in on our certificate program is to be the one to challenge organizations around this area. So to do an assessment of actually what's going on at your organization, have that conversation with management. If you are in management, have that conversation at the executive level and with boards and see what we can do about it from a planning standpoint and also a performance standpoint, since we put performance metrics in on many other things at nonprofit organizations. I believe Ms. Walia is up next to kind of walk through 3 of our courses, and then Dr. Duchess Humphrey will join you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Yes, we can go ahead and move to the next slide as well. Again, my name is Jasmine Walia, and I'll be discussing 3 of our course topics in the Social Justice Leadership Program. And my hope today is to provide you with some of the subject matter that our participants will walk away with involved in this course, as well as some of the intended learning outcomes and action items that we plan to leave them with so that they can take back to their organizations at the end of each of these courses. So focused on the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as the distinction between each, this course, Social and Racial Justice, Leading Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Within Public Service Organizations, begins at the interpersonal level, examining unconscious bias and stereotypes. Participants in the course move from cultural competency to cultural humility, where they are exposed to implementation strategies such as the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. I'd like to spend some time explaining a few of the fundamental principles related to diversity, equity, and inclusion that participants will also learn about in this course. There is no consensus for definitions of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and a one-size-fits-all approach would be ineffective for organizations. Diversity is a starting point or stepping stone toward equity. It is simply the numerical representation of different types of people. Once an organization has diversified, it is important to create a culture of inclusivity, which includes creating a safe space that promotes a true sense of belonging. Diversity and inclusion are critical elements to making a more equitable organization. And equity is something that is far deeper and more complex and focuses on access and opportunity for all members of our society. Its emphasis is on understanding and striving to remove systemic barriers that block achievement. Why does this matter? Diversity within organizations has proven to increase innovation, effectiveness in programming, and overall organizational growth. Unfortunately, the nonprofit sector, like other sectors, struggles with interorganizational diversity. While 42% of nonprofit organizations have female executive directors, only 87% of 87% of executive directors are white, with only minimal representation of African American, Hispanic, and Asian individuals. In addition, the board source study, Leading with Intent, found that among board chairs and executives from more than 1,300 surveyed organizations, 84% of board members were white, and 27% of boards surveyed did not have a single person of color on their board. As organizations are looking in depth at their organizational structures, at this point in time in particular, and they're searching for ways to promote equity, there's a great amount of room for improvement. Organizations must prioritize diversity, inclusion, and equity to achieve change in their organizations. This course also focuses on the difference between microaggressions and unconscious bias and how they can impede an organization's culture. Microaggressions are the brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults towards members of oppressed groups. Microaggressions can take the form of microassaults, microinsults, or microinvalidations. Unconscious bias can be the cause of an individual or organization's use of microaggressions. Unconscious biases are social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside of their own conscious awareness. Everyone holds unconscious beliefs about various social and identity groups, and these biases stem from one's tendency to organize the social world into categories. What is the impact of microaggressions and unconscious bias in organizations? The organizational unconscious is essentially unconscious bias at the structural level, as opposed to individual. Organizational unconscious consists of patterns or norms of behavior which exert significant influence over organizational decision-making, choices, and behaviors. It is often the reason that organizational diversity, inclusion, and equity efforts fail. When bias is embedded into an organization's culture, there are continual lasting effects that take time and effort to change. And this time and effort often does start at the leadership level. Another impact of microaggressions and unconscious bias is poor organizational culture, which can lead to low levels of staff retention, unmotivated employees, and other inefficiencies. To combat this, organizations are implementing unconscious bias trainings and diversity trainings. A 2017 Harvard Business Review article describes a longitudinal study that found traditional diversity trainings are the least effective efforts in increasing numbers of underrepresented minorities in organizations. Information found at diversity trainings can sometimes be unhelpful and even condone use of stereotypes. On the other hand, a meta-analysis found that diversity trainings can be effective depending on factors such as the content, the length of the training, the audience, and accompanying diversity efforts within that organization. The developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, or DMIS, was created by Dr. Milton Bennett as a framework for how to explain how people experience and engage cultural differences. The DMIS continuum extends from ethnocentrism, the experience of one's own culture as central to reality, to ethno-relativism, which is the experience of one's own and other cultures as relative to context. The DMIS model offers a powerful theory for understanding how leaders can experience and interpret issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity. The broad lesson for this course for organizations is that improving diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Equity begins with leaders educating themselves about racial and cultural biases, and from there, leaders can provide staff with high-quality development and equitable practices. Next slide, please. The purpose of managing workplace diversity in public and nonprofit organizations is to increase the participants' understanding of relevant human experiences in organizational settings, especially as today's workforce continues to change both domestically and globally. Advantages and challenges of diversity in the workplace are examined, along with workforce managerial strategies that can contribute to positive outcomes for employees, employers, and other stakeholders. In the course, this is achieved by examining diversity as constituted through the intersections of social categories such as race, gender, ethnicity, nationality, age, and so on. Examining the importance of cultures in public and nonprofit organizations and work teams, and the challenges that may come for managers with increased multiculturalism. Reviewing, discussing, and understanding the legalities that concern diversity, such as affirmative action and other notable legal cases that may be relevant to organizations. Developing greater competency and appropriate skills for working effectively with people from diverse backgrounds and orientations. Examining the impacts of diversity on organizational outcomes, such as job performance and job satisfaction, and exploring contemporary organizational strategies for maintaining workplace diversity. In this course, the primary action item for participants is working to create a diversity plan. The process involves identifying a diversity issue that is discussed in the course that is relevant to their organization, developing a plan that includes identifying solutions and recommending a solution to be implemented. We hope the participants take this diversity plan back to their respective organizations for implementation, along with their newfound knowledge and skills from this course as well as the others in the program. Next slide, please. Social Justice, Policy, and Partnerships for Change is the final course in the 5-course sequence that Dr. Taylor was explaining a bit more about earlier. And this course examines how to identify a public policy issue and how to begin an issue-based advocacy campaign to create a social justice movement. We hope to guide participants from an awareness of social justice to the more action-oriented piece where they can move forward, move into advocacy if they so desire. And with this course, we hope that they have the tools to do so. The course increases participants' understanding of issues, examines the difference between advocacy and lobbying, and facilitates the start of planning. So I would like to discuss some of the concepts in this course, such as the ACT model, quick and persuasive messaging, coalition building, and the difference between advocacy and lobbying, as well as the continuum that surrounds social justice movements. So this course will follow the ACT model. The A stands for assess, the C stands for cultivate, and the T stands for teach. When someone assesses a situation, they look at it to see what's in front of them. When they cultivate, they begin to operate with an understanding of the people and the community around them. Developing relationships and asking about the buzzwords that activate a community is a key part of cultivating. And then teaching can occur. Driving change may involve touching a keyboard or shaking hands, but this is the high touch portion that involves teaching. So let's break down the A for assess a bit more. When working on an assessment, it is important to determine a systemic issue or a movement that is working to address an existing systemic issue. Then it's time to move to research and collect data that allows storytelling to begin. In movement making, it's essential to find motivation around the change being sought out. This is how people will get involved and how the movement can be determined. Next is cultivation. Cultivation gets people involved in a movement and can involve others, including an advisory board or cultural ambassadors. Creating an advisory board allows people to come together and hold a movement leader accountable for a cause. Advisory board members might also go out into the community and identify partners, or they may provide funding. Cultural ambassadors are people who will walk around the community and invite people to join the cause. Leaders of social justice movements can equip cultural ambassadors with as much data and information as possible for when they're on the ground in the community talking to people about the movement. The teaching and training process involves everyone in the movement. Providing the why and showing others the data that's been collected in the earlier steps is very important here. People might choose to start their own movement or join an existing one, but this is where the change is seen in communities. The more people that are brought along in the movement, the better off it will be. Social justice movements rely on messaging, so participants in the course will learn how to create a quick and persuasive message that conveys what they want people to know about their social justice cause and mission. This provides an elevator pitch of sorts that can be shared with a coalition, so everyone's values, ideas, and language are aligned, including key data points and an invitation or call to action at the end of a message like this really does strengthen it as well. Social justice movements also benefit from coalition building. When building a coalition, it's important to determine a sunset date. There's no beginning or end to a social justice movement, but it is important to create a coalition that advances a particular part of the movement. Then different stages can involve different coalitions. Establishing an understanding about values and behaviors to set expectations within your coalition can also reduce conflict. Determining deal breakers, such as walking away because legislation gets watered down, is the final step in coalition building. There's a good handle on the goals and the sunset, as well as deal breakers, the coalition is on track. When advancing social change, it is also important to know the difference between advocacy and lobbying. Advocacy is when individuals or organizations begin to educate, whether it be educating other individuals, the broader community, or elected officials. Many nonprofits stay in the advocacy space and do avoid lobbying. However, lobbying is sometimes needed to advance a specific social justice movement. Lobbying involves asking for a specific type of legislative instrument to move forward, and partnerships tend to come together more so when lobbying occurs. Finally, social justice movements are continuous. The first stage involves planning, the middle stage consists of doing the work, but there is no end stage. After beginning to do the work, it is necessary to implement change in addition to maintaining the messaging and conducting checks to see how the change is going. Thank you for your attention as I've discussed these 3 courses in our program. I will now pass it off to Dr. Duchess Humphrey to lead the discussion on cultural competency.
Hello. As nonprofit professionals, be it in scholarship and or practice, we are called to adopt this idea of good governance. That is, as leaders, we engage in sound accountability practices, we control dysfunction, we're called also to constitute or at least engage in constituted direction and cultural competence. All of these involve functions wherein those within the structure of governance steward. So what's this idea of cultural competence? In the course that I will be leading, we will understand cultural competence from 3 agreed upon definitions that are outlined in the literature. The first being it's a respect for and understanding of diverse ethnic and cultural groups, their histories, their traditions, their beliefs, and also value systems in the provision and delivery of service. We will also look at cultural competency through the lens of a definition set by Cross, which states that cultural competence is a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and also policies that are coming together or that have come together within a system, agency, and the professional, which enable that system, agency, and professional to work effectively in those cross-cultural situations that a lot of nonprofits engage in every day. The third agreed upon definition for cultural competence is the ability to effectively interact with individuals who are different from oneself. So, under this assumption of cultural competence, we will develop culturally competent public servants. But this requires three key elements. The first being cultural awareness, which involves embracing, strategically recognizing, and also adjusting the cultural context in which one's own cultural values, our beliefs, our perceptions, and also our biases differ from that of others. We'll also look at our cultural knowledge. And this is a deliberate understanding and development and fostering of one's perspective and position on various cultural groups. We'll then look at cultural skills, which is that embodiment of the various attributes that we obtain or attain from cultural awareness and cultural knowledge. This situates public servants to effective, efficient, and equitable identification, discussion, and continuous assessment of the specific needs of those in which we serve. Next slide. All right, so before we have this idea of multiculturalism, affirmative action, diversity, even social justice, we have to look at cultural competence first. Expounding on the cultural competency cycle developed by Mitchell Rice, as a primary action item, we will develop a cultural competency plan that leaders may use in their respective organizations. The goal is for culturally competent public servants within these organizations to enhance and actively participate in culturally competent leadership. The cultural competency plan, when used, warrants nonprofit leaders to develop a common understanding of cultural competency. Also, it asks them to promote an organizational culture within their organizations that encourages constant and consistent learning. Last, we will have them evaluate their policies, or it's at least a call for them to evaluate their policies and their charters and other institutional instruments to ensure that these directives are supportive of outreach, transparency, and of course, inclusiveness in the dissemination of information and advocacy of minority groups, those groups who have been historically disenfranchised, and also those groups who are underrepresented. Participant outcomes. First, being that we want to develop or help our leaders develop an understanding about the relevance of cultural competency in our non-governmental organizations or our nonprofits. We also want to highlight the history of cultural competency as a process at the organizational level. We also want to examine various strategies regarding how to assess and retain a workforce that is culturally competent and engage with our constituent public. Thank you so much.
Oh no, I'm still here. I was just trying to it looks like Dalia, thanks so much for your question. The question is how to describe the relationship between justice and equity. And really, I looked at the two on some level, meaning at least referring to the same thing on some level. So when we say social justice, that's actually what we're looking for. So as we talk to stakeholders about a program during the development of, and we've been quite transparent around this idea of there are a lot more raised awareness, it seems like, of the conversation of diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'll just go back to something that I said a little earlier. We're in this to promote the idea that more equity in terms of people of color in leadership roles at nonprofit organizations is absolutely justice when you consider the population of people that many nonprofit community organizations, public service organizations serve in communities. So if we can accomplish some of that in terms of our recruiting, being transparent around that, when we reach out to folks that want to take part in a program like this. Um, Thus far, the feedback has been, yes, I'm interested in it, and this is a conversation that I could have uh, around my organization. And I don't believe that it has anything to do with size of organizations as well, because I think this could be just as important for smaller organizations where if you're planning for the future, if you're going through some type of vision setting at your organization as a small organization, and you can think about these things and simply put it down on paper, but taking part in that process. So when I think about justice and equity, I'm basically speaking the same language. I don't know. Dr. Humphrey might have some other comments on that.
Thank you, Kenny. I agree with you wholeheartedly. One thing about justice in the nonprofit context is, um, let's see, we have to think about it along the lines of advocacy, simply stated. As nonprofit professionals or public servants, if we think about justice or social justice through that lens of advocacy, then we're always making certain that whom we serve are at the forefront of what we do. When we think of equality or equity, we're thinking about how effective are we being in our engagement and treating everyone in a manner in which they are, in a manner in which they feel and also are um, a part of the organization or a part of the mission and vision of the organization. So coupling those things together, we see that, to me, equity comes before justice in a sense. However, they work wholeheartedly together. Hope I answered that.
Quick check to see if any other questions or comments. Okay. Yeah, just one thing that I mean, I just go back to again in the development or framework that we're thinking back to the idea of organizations moving from uh, thinking about this to putting things into action at their organizations, no matter how small a step that might be. It wasn't that long ago that I was researching in the area of how people of color narrate their experiences at nonprofit organizations. And just to make sure that I'm also really transparent as a school of government and public service, I mean, we have other researchers at the school that have looked at issues ranging from pay equity in higher education settings. We have Dr. Will Brown, who is a prominent researcher in the field of board governance, who has looked at inclusive board practices. This is an area that we're truly concerned with in terms of an academic institution and as far as training, tomorrow's leaders. So what are those small steps? I think that this applies across a variety of organizational settings. I think that smaller nonprofit organizations sometimes feel like we can't do this at our organization. And if that happens to be the case, that's the beauty in planning. That if you're thinking in that direction, those are things that you can visualize, have discussions on, write out on paper that as we grow, because any executive or anyone who's leading a public service organization should be thinking about quality growth and how we spread or deepen or advance our mission in the communities that we serve in. And so, if that's on your mind and you have the opportunity to visualize some of the things that we're talking about, we see that as an action oriented step at a smaller organization. If you're a larger organization, more mature, you have the opportunity, I believe anyway, that those organizations have the opportunity to at least start discussing some of these things actively. We uh, engage with a variety of organizations across the state of Texas, across the United States, and around the globe. And the one thing that still does not make sense to me is that conversation of equity, social justice, race, it just still doesn't come up. And I think there is a line to why we continue to see people of color not holding leadership roles at nonprofit organizations. I mean, there's a lot of spotlight on this area right now, but I'm hesitant to believe that something is going to change until we start to take action at our nonprofit organizations. And so, uh, if nonprofit organization leaders and boards can put a strategic plan in place, if nonprofit boards and executives can go out and fundraise and have performance requirements around how much money they need to raise to make sure that our mission is sustained and can potentially advance. I'm still somewhat at a loss for why can't we have more conversations around mission advancement along the lines of having people of color in decision making roles that help benefit the communities that we know nonprofit organizations and public service organizations are responsible for serving.
Greg, thank you for your question. I can kind of kick us off in regards to responding to part of it, at least the first part of the question. But I would say that if an organization is more involved in programming or direct services, they would still have an ability to educate and touch the community in a way that is maybe not the level of advocacy that certain organizations do that have someone who's in charge of their government relations department or something that maybe larger organizations have the capacity to fulfill. But thinking at the local and community level, there are certainly ways to get involved. If you know that zoning is an issue, for example, and there's a housing organization that supports fair and equitable housing in your community, that could be something that maybe a more programmatic or direct service organization could do a good job of just educating people as to what those zoning laws are and how they might impact them on a day-to-day level. I think that there's a lot of different levels that can be lower touch and might actually make sense with some organizations' mission in regards to delivering more of a programmatic or social service focus that don't necessarily go to the level of going to your legislature. But another way that organizations that are more focused on the social service or programming method of service delivery, they could get involved in coalitions. I mean, they could join up with organizations that are also doing the work maybe a little bit more prominently in the community and ask, what do you need? What do you need from us? What do you need from our constituents? Maybe there are ways that the board can get involved. I think that these are conversations that can begin to occur, and that could be a question that's explored. And you could just see what the comfort level of the organization is in moving into that space incrementally.
Sorry about jumping off there for a second, but if I'm reading the question that's up correctly in terms of organizations advocating more to be effective, I'm a total believer in that. And that mostly comes from personal experience in the field as an organization. And I'm referring to my time with Big Brothers Big Sisters. Advocacy, generally speaking, again, if I'm catching the question correctly, we know that organizations have missions that they work toward and are committed to, have a duty to. But many times organizations spin a bit. And so we've all heard of that concept of mission drift. Where I've seen organizations have success is when they align their mission with some advocacy issue in your particular community. At the time for us, we felt like what we contributed to was graduation rates because we saw and had data on that children who received mentors and spent at least a couple of years together, they were more likely to graduate from high school than their peers, which happened to be a pretty big public service issue in the community that I was in at the time. So advocating makes sense and I believe leads to good things like more investments towards missions. And then when you say, or when the question there on being more authentic, I just truly believe that that starts with the individual. So, how can organizations advocate in a more authentic way? Is to make sure that you have authentic leaders that will speak the truth and be transparent, knowing that that aligns a lot nicer with advancing missions at organizations. So, how do you get organizations to advocate more authentically? Is to have the right people around the table that are authentic themselves personally. I'm sure there's hopefully maybe one more question. We have just a couple of minutes left. I don't know whether Jasmine or Duchess, any final thoughts in wrapping this all up?
I don't think I have anything additionally, but thank you for your attention. And Dr. Taylor, Dr. Humphrey, it's always a pleasure to get to speak with you all on these topics.
Always. And I think if our host doesn't mind, on the last couple of slides, if anyone is who joined us today is interested in learning more or connecting with any of us personally, we can easily be found. I think, again, if we can get the deck up and go to one of the last slide there, feel free to reach out to learn more about our programs that we have at the Bush School. We're very thankful to the University of San Diego. As you can imagine, we wouldn't be here without an invitation. We consider them peers. We've worked with them many times before. They provided such leadership on all the COVID-related surveying that was going on that we took part in, and we certainly consider the University of San Diego a peer and appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today about our programs. And again, certainly speaking on behalf of all of us, personally willing to be contacted if anyone has any further questions. Thank you so much.